Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see so many people joining us this afternoon. My name is Damien Hills. I'm a member of the board of the British Chamber here in Singapore and a member of the executive committee, which is a subset of the board that is more actively involved with the Chamber's day-to-day activities. One of my roles is to chair the business committees. The Chamber, for those of you that don't know, is made up of a number of business committees, and those business committees are a forum for information exchange, for advocacy, and for thought leadership in their areas of focus. And that thought leadership comes through in published content, online, offline, and in events. And over the years, the events have been very useful for people to attend, but they've also provided a networking element. And obviously, this year, we've had to forego the networking element. A few weeks ago, we tried to do a digital networking event, and it was a great success. And we had some really positive feedback. So today we are having another digital networking event, and it's fabulous to see 78 people joining us for this event. The event today is themed. It's around future cities, and we have industry experts with us today who are going to facilitate that discussion from Arup, from the Carbon Trust, and from Mott McDonald. And our discussion is going to be around planning, around integration of property with transport and public space. We're going to focus a little bit on sustainability and green infrastructure and low carbon strategies, digital transformation. And we're going to draw on the experience of our speakers from the region and beyond. And in fact, our speakers are joining us from Australia and from the UK, as well as here in Singapore. And maybe a great opportunity for me to thank them all in advance for their participation today. We have Neil Walmsley from Arup, joined with Joan Coe, also from Arup, and she's in Australia, in Melbourne, locked down at home. Rob Hatcher from the Carbon Trust, who's in London. Derek Murray, who's here from Mott McDonald in Singapore, and Sophia Magad is also here in Singapore. So an immediate thank you to all of you for your contribution today. We're going to start with Neil. And Neil's Principal in Southeast Asia Advisory Planning and Design Leader at Arup. Neil is going to talk to us a little bit, I think, about city planning, the integration of property and transport and infrastructure and public spaces. And he's got a variety of very relevant experience, including work on the Abu Dhabi 2030 city plan. And currently, as he was just saying before we joined, Indonesia's new capital master plan. So Neil, I'm going to hand over to you. I know that you're going to hand over to Joan, so maybe you might like to introduce her when you're in the middle of your presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Damien. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me and that you can see the slides? Wow, double whammy. I won't push my luck any further. So my colleague Joan is joining us. Joan looks after our planning and advisory team in Melbourne for the state of Victoria in Australia. And I'll introduce Joan partway through the presentation. So about 15 minutes, just some musings around city sustainability, the integration of transport and land use, some thoughts on green infrastructure, and maybe a few questions for people to go to the first break. So without further ado, I'll crack on. And I guess just building on the introduction, I also, as part of my role here, represent the Arup Future Cities Hub in Singapore, which is an initiative working with EDB and Infrastructure Asia, and with some of our global partners, including C40 and the Global Resiliency Network. So on behalf of all of them, it's great just to be here and to have the opportunity to talk. And I think I'll start with the subject of cities, and hopefully what you see is a complicated looking slide that captures all of the different things that city leaders, city decision makers might think about in how they want their city to evolve and how they want to shape the place that their citizens inhabit. And that diagram could apply to any city, any town, any district in the world. But the question that provokes is, what are city leaders really trying to achieve? And so if you think about Singapore, what's Singapore's agenda? What's Singapore trying to achieve? Number one, Singapore is trying to attract investment. And it's trying to attract investment in a complicated and competitive international environment. It's also trying to retain its own talent, stop its talent from disappearing elsewhere for more interesting things, and to attract more talent to come here and many of us on the call, I think, are people who perhaps grew up elsewhere but have chosen to spend parts of our professional lives in Singapore. And I'll talk in a minute about perhaps some of the reasons why. But Singapore is not just competing with Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok, it's also competing on a world stage with Hong Kong, with New York, or with London. So this is a global competition between cities. So then the question comes, how do we decide which city we want to be in? What drives people's decision making? And how are cities being measured? And a couple of examples on the screen, the Mercer Quality of Living Index. They say Vienna's the greatest city in the world, and that's the approximate order, Singapore down to Jakarta for the Southeast Asian kind of primary cities. The Economist Intelligence Unit also think Vienna's the greatest city in the world, but they've got Melbourne and Sydney next on the list. And again, a similar order of priority, order of attractiveness for the Southeast Asian cities. So these are the kind of things that cities are being compared with each other using. And these reports have got different content driving different scoring mechanisms, and hence you get different results. It's certainly in terms of who came second and third. Underlying a lot of this is quality of life. If you ultimately go to a decision maker and say, what was the pitch that you were elected on? Hopefully they would say something like, to improve the quality of life of the people I represent. Yeah, that's the textbook answer from a textbook politician. And this diagram is from the European Commission, and it sets out what they think quality of life means. And it's a range of things that you might call necessities: access to health, access to education, economic and physical safety, but also a long list of things that are enhancements, things like the overall experience of life. Yeah, and we can go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we can talk about what's important and what drives people's decision making. If I try and simplify that, all of those things have to also come back to, can you afford to do it? All of those things come back to the city you choose to live in. How much did you actually know about it when you choose to go there, when you chose to go there? There's also this element of, is it a city that's got a bad rep for things that you don't want to be seen to be supporting and associated with? And that quite often ties back to this concept of sustainability. So one of the underlying themes that BritCham wanted to cover today was sustainability. And I'm conscious we have a very broad audience with different backgrounds. So sustainability, and this is the definition that I grew up with through my academic training, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And future generations could be 15, 20, 25-year gap. So that statement is at least 1.5 generations old, and certainly still rings true to me in terms of what it means. And in that time, the whole concept of sustainability has become much more defined. So we have this sustainability sitting in the middle of an environmental stewardship. It's not just about trees, a social stewardship, equity for society, and an economic aspect. And there's even, the thought school have gone into the next level of detail on how the things in between join up. And I'm only sharing this so that we're all on the same page. The next level on sustainability, starting in the year 2000, the UN started with their Millennium Goals. And by 2015, these had evolved to be in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I would imagine that the vast majority of people on the call have seen those 17 colored squares before. And if someone said, have you heard of the UN SDGs? They'd say, yes, I've heard of them. I'd also imagine that many of you have never gone any deeper because there's nothing making you press on those squares and go deeper. But if you did choose to do so, you'd find that, for example, Sustainable Cities and Communities, one of the themes, has 10 underlying targets. Yeah, and some of those targets, and they're very diverse, and they're very clearly articulated, because as you'd imagine, UN puts out very documents that are very intellectually robust. And if you actually then take all of what I've said, you've got one definition for sustainability. You've got the 3 pillars: social, economic, and environmental. There are 17 SDGs, which when you combine them give you 169 targets. And the targets are all benchmarked as a 2030 end date. What does that give you? That gives you lots of tension. Yeah. For example, Marina Bay. Yeah. Marina Bay reclamation project. Clearly, there are negative sustainability components to that story. Equally, as we all know, Gardens by the Bay, one of the world's most successful public spaces, there are some very positive economic aspects and very positive social aspects. Here's a picture of a very nice new road going through what used to be a very nice untouched forest. That road connects people to opportunity, but is that road an appropriate thing to put through that forest? So there's always that tension. Finally, one of the world's most efficient combined power and water desalination plants enables an entire economy to exist in a place that might not otherwise exist. So there's a tension there. Is that sustainable, and on what agenda? Which agendas are we running with? I want to use a couple of examples, one from me, one from Joan, just to kind of bounce around further on the complexity of cities and the kind of trade-offs and balances that have to be made. So at a city scale, what are the key ingredients for sustainable urban transport? And the diagram, I think, gives you a clue. It's not about adding more lanes. So this is what cities might have looked like pre-motorized vehicle. This is a place in Turkey called Mardin, and the size of the place is defined by the distance people could walk, because there's no point having a place that's too big for the people that live there. It would never justify itself. And that means that from your front door to anything you could possibly need is no more than a 10-minute walk. This is Sydney in 1890s, and we were having congestion problems and the horse manure crisis, because people had realized that horses pulling vehicles that they could sit in was a good way to improve their ability to travel distances. And then here, early 1900s, the production line for vehicle manufacturing and the beginning of the car era and all of the things that came with it. Fast forward to the 1950s, London, and the size of Oxford Street was already defined at that point. Oxford Street was not designed to accommodate the traffic that might go there one day. The width of Oxford Street was defined based on the underground network that sits below it, the drainage systems that sit below it, and the planning principles of how big a street should be before anyone had realized that the more cars you can create, the more people can drive them, the bigger the corridors would have to be. And around the same time this document was published, anyone with a transport planning background, you must have spent a seminar listening to this one. Basically, this document, 1963, said that if we design towns to accommodate vehicles, we will end up with places that we don't like. Fast forward to the year 2000, Los Angeles, they clearly didn't get the memo, because until right into the early 2010s, LA was investing in a very sprawling city that was dominated by 12-lane highway corridors like the one you can see at the foot of the screen. But as part of the 2016 elections, LA voted to invest billions of dollars in shifting away from a car culture. However, there are still bad stories, cities that didn't get the memo, and this is Jakarta. And if you go right back to the beginning and think about the 5 or 10 minute walk, and then look at this image, if you live on the right-hand side of that image and you want to go somewhere on the left, yeah, the city's infrastructure really isn't set up to facilitate that. The overall consequence is people are now making irrational decisions about how they behave based on the spaces that have been created for them to live in. We have air quality issues that are heavily linked to tailpipe emissions. We have road accidents as the highest single cause of death in men aged 16 to 30 in the world. We have an image here of lots of people using infrastructure whilst having no economic contribution whatsoever. And we have an image here where there's twice as much infrastructure, but only, the same amount of infrastructure, but only half the people. So at least the one before, the infrastructure was being used efficiently. In this one, there's lots of people doing nothing particularly economically valuable either. And finally, a piece of high quality prime urban land that spends most of its sunlight hours doing nothing other than storing vehicles, while the people that were using them go and do something else. Back onto the theme of sustainability, ultimately all of this is inefficient. It doesn't support the sustainability aims that the UN SDGs embody and that the world is striving to achieve, or the sustainability aims that sit behind people's quality of life decision making. And there's plenty of evidence to support that. Why is that? Because cities have been designed around vehicles, which are the least efficient use of 3.5 meter wide corridors in cities. And so what's the solution? The solution is not a transport solution, and this is, I guess, the illustration. The solution is an integrated transport land use plan. Singapore, from the 91 plan, from the 2011 plan, has always had a very strong culture of integrated urban development, integrated urban planning, so that the development of demand has been integrated with the development of capacity to accommodate that demand. Apologies for the resolution on this, but the dotted green line that runs through the middle essentially reinforces that if you put people within access of high quality public transport, they will use it. And by doing so, you will have a more sustainable and efficient place. At the city scale, that's about integrated land use transport planning. At a district scale, it's exactly the same thing. Transit-oriented development, increasing the density in proximity to the transit nodes. And when you get down to the street level, if you can make streets places where people want to be, then you can also create moments of magic, places that are a pleasure to spend time, not just places that, as this image suggests, are only there to accommodate people trying to get around, and in this instance, a very inequitable allocation of that space. This is what it feels like to be a pedestrian in a car-dominated city. The only clarification is that the planks only appear every 2 minutes for 30 seconds. Yeah, second-class citizen at best. And this is, I guess, an image that explains the efficiency potential of doing things differently. So if we get walkability right, so much of the rest will follow. And coming right back to where I started, if you talk to, for example, London about walkability, they do not talk about walkability as a transport thing. They talk about it as a health thing and as a quality of life thing. So bringing the story right back to the start, if we can get integrated transport and land use, we can end up with happy, healthy people in cities and therefore places where people want to be, winning that global fight for investment. The second example, and I'll hand over to Joan in a moment, is about infrastructure in cities. And World Bank estimates that over the next 30 years, the total value of infrastructure in the world needs to double. This is on the back of population growth, urbanization, and all the other mega trends that are driving behavior. But that infrastructure has to be delivered in a smarter, more sustainable, more resilient way. And John can talk maybe for 3 or 4 minutes about some of the observations about how cities are investing in green infrastructure as we move around the world. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Neil. I think if you see any picture of a future city, it's usually covered in green and green roofs. No one seems to be rushing to make those green roofs happen, so cities have started putting in planning requirements. So all I'm going to do is spend a little bit on a couple of cities and how those regulations vary depending on the political context and the economic context of each city. So even if you have exactly the same solution, which is green infrastructure, the way you implement it is very different from city to city. Next slide, Neil. So New York's the latest cab off the rank. They've now made it 100% of all roofs that can have a green roof or a PV has to have solar panels or greening. You get a tax break if you do urban greening. So they've decided to just what I would call carpet bomb everything, get as many things on as many roofs as possible. Even if it's low quality, it's worth it because of the capacity and the supply chain that they build in the industry. Next slide, Neil. Seattle has been doing this for about 13 years, and what they're struggling with now is that they've been quite codified with what they're asking people to do for their roofs, and they've ended up with an enormous manual of things that they can do for green roofs, and it's not really flexible for people's planning system. I think the city's planning systems don't do a very good job in enabling design autonomy, so they're going to revise all their requirements, but they do have a long legacy of green roofs now that they've learnt from. Next slide, Neil. In contrast, Washington exemplifies what you would call a completely capitalist free market approach to urban greening. So they've set up a stormwater trading system, and a developer has to require stormwater absorption on their lots, but they can buy out that. So what you find is a lot of schools and homeowners are now putting in green infrastructure, and developers are buying those credits. And while some people might think the developers are buying out their obligations, for Washington, DC, it's ended up being a better outcome, getting the whole state distributing all that ability to soak up stormwater and treat it, rather than concentrating to a couple of development lots. that the free market has actually delivered the right solution for Washington, DC. The next one. And in contrast, you've got the sponge city initiatives in Shanghai and other Chinese cities, where they all have to absorb an enormous amount of water on individual lots. The technical guidelines are very stringent, very specific, and the Chinese government has gone through the city governments a systematic exercise of working out what each little plot has to do to make sure the whole ecosystem and the whole catchment works. And that kind of approach really only works in a centralized control environment like Shanghai, as opposed to a place like the US where the free market is the best solution. The next slide. And then we come to Singapore, which is somewhere in between. So Singapore's a leader in green infrastructure, maybe because it's tropical, but in Singapore, if you, in the middle of the city, if you replace any green space with your development, if you triple the replacement rate, anything you do over and beyond a 3 times replacement rate, you get to build more floor area. So it makes a lot of financial sense to do that greening in Singapore. The most interesting thing about Singapore was the way this requirement was introduced. It's a hard requirement, but when it was introduced in 2010, the Singapore government had quite a large fund to help developers make that change, but it was a first come, first served. So here's a stack of money, go for it. Once the money's gone, it's gone. So all the developers rushed in to take advantage of that assistance. And by the time all that money was gone, there was enough capability in the industry to just make it a business as usual norm. So an amazing blending of regulation and government subsidy. London, you can't put in a new regulation in London for anyone. It's very much a deregulation environment. But luckily for London, they have an industry, a development industry that is very competitive, and there's a lot of brand value in voluntarily delivering green infrastructure. So you get scenarios where Arup's helping 3 major landowners do an ecological corridor through London because it's good for their brand and because they're really nice people, those developers. And then the last one, Melbourne, we're working on a new planning requirement. Neil, next slide. Where we're following the lead of Helsinki and Berlin. We've got a calculation tool that we hope balances being very ambitious and prescriptive in outcomes while giving each development the opportunity to choose a green infrastructure solution that reflects the opportunities and constraints of their site. And together it should all add up into a green infrastructure master plan that makes sense. So that's the hope. My last slide is just, I won't go through it in detail, but it's just showing that the different places do different things to achieve the same outcomes. The thing that interests me the most is just the diversity of drivers. In Berlin, it's really, since Volkswagen diesel disaster, it's been about air quality. In London, it's driven by the collapse of the bees. In Melbourne, it's stormwater and also preparing for the bushfire impacts. So green infrastructure is a solution to lots of different problems, and cities can all tackle it in their own way. That's the end of my bit.
Thanks very much, Joan. Awesome. So just to wrap up, we started with this diagram of cities and how complex they are as an entity, as a set of systems. We've given you a couple of stories around land use, transport and green infrastructure. And I think to take us into the first break, I'd just like to leave with a final slide that sets out a few potential discussion points that Damien might want to pick up on. So back to you, Damien. Thank you. You're on mute, Damien.
Oh, Damien, you're just on mute.
Thank you, Helen. Very helpful. I was going to say, Neil, Joan, thank you very much indeed. Some great images there of cities that maybe some of us haven't seen before, and help us understand the trends and provoke some thoughts around the drivers and the approaches to planning that are being adopted by authorities around the world, all of whom have a focus on sustainability. So thank you very much for that input.